Welcome to the deep dive. We take a stack of sources, unpack the key insights, and get you well-informed fast. Now, when you think about the Ottoman Empire, probably images of sheer scale come to mind, right? This empire lasted for centuries, spanned continents.
Absolutely huge, yeah.
But how did it actually work? Especially somewhere as, well, complex as the Balkans. We're talking peak period, maybe early to mid 16th century. We're doing a deep dive today into what people often call the Ottoman system there.
Right. And, that term itself, Ottoman system, it can be a little bit tricky. It kind of suggests this rigid, uniform thing that probably didn't exist across its entire history or even everywhere at the same time.
Okay.
You see, early historians, often outsiders, right, they use terms like slave government administration or talked about power sharing between, governing and religious establishments.
Mm-hmm.
And look, those aren't totally wrong, but they might not fully capture how the Ottomans themselves saw it. They had these really deep-seated, integrated, theocratic ideas. It wasn't always separate boxes like that.
Mm-hmm. That's a really important point. So, okay, our mission today is to unpack all these nuances, try and get past the usual cliches. We're going to look at the three sort of fundamental sectors that really define the system: the military administrative side, the religious legal side, and the social economic side.
Yeah, the pillars, really.
Exactly. And I think you'll find some genuinely surprising stuff here, giving you a much deeper take on how this incredible empire actually functioned day to day. So let's start with what seems like the absolute backbone, the military administrative sector.
Yeah.
You said the Ottoman Empire was fundamentally an Islamic state, not just a Turkish one.
Yeah.
How did that religious identity shape, well, everything?
Oh, profoundly.
Yeah.
I mean, Islamic principles meant they saw the world in two parts. The domain of Islam, lands under their rule, and the domain of war, basically non-Muslim territories.
Okay.
Now, this wasn't just abstract theology. It was a core principle. It meant the state had to be structured for constant defense and expansion. So the entire administrative setup basically became synonymous with military organization.
Wow. Okay. So the whole empire structured like a giant army compound. How did that play out in terms of administration and power?
Well, it led to this really unique structure. Anyone fully part of the ruling system was called askari, which literally means military.
Yeah.
They were the ruling elite.
All right.
And at the very top, you have the sultan. He starts as this nomad warrior leader, but evolves into this absolute autocratic, almost God-ordained emperor figure.
Absolute power.
Pretty much. He's the protector, the owner of the state, head of the Islamic community, the only source of civil law, controls all the offices. The main limits were really Islamic precepts and tradition. And critically, he had proprietary ownership of all state lands, the Miri lands, and control over every official job.
Yeah.
That really cemented his central role.
Okay, so the Sultan's the linchpin. How did they actually manage all that conquered land, the Miri? That gets us to the Sipahilic system, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. These Miri lands were given out in a way historians sometimes call pseudo-feudal. It was the Sipahilic system. Basically, a Sipahi, who was usually a cavalryman, he got the right to collect taxes from a piece of land. Not ownership of the land itself or the people on it, mind you.
Just the revenue.
Exactly. In return, he owed the state fixed duties, mostly military service. And these fiefs, they varied in value. You had smaller taimars for the rank-and-file cavalry and bigger, more valuable zemits for high-ranking officials.
Interesting. And where'd this idea come from?
Well, the Ottomans were incredibly practical. It had roots in older Seljuk traditions, and it looked a bit like the Byzantine pronoia system they encountered. They often just adapted existing local administrative units, like sankaks and kazas. Sometimes these directly corresponded to the lands previously held by Christian lords.
So smart adaptation, not just conquest. It sounds like a really effective way to lock in the loyalty of powerful warriors, make them settled, dependent on the system.
It was, initially. It forged them into an effective force.
But I guess giving out land, even just the tax right, still means power is spread out a bit. Doesn't that create a risk of, disloyalty down the line?
You've put your finger right on it. Yeah. That was the potential problem. The Sipahilic system worked, but local leaders could build their own power bases.
Oh.
So the sultans, pretty early on, developed something else, a separate personal power base. The Kapikulu system.
The Kapikulu. And this was based on slavery.
Yes, institutionalized slavery.
Yeah.
It sounds jarring to us, but it was central.
Mm-hmm.
It started under Murad I. He took captured Balkan Christian soldiers as his share of war booty. These slaves, or kuls, were trained directly under him. They formed new units like the famous Janissary infantry and the Guard cavalry. Their loyalty was absolute because they depended entirely on the Sultan. He owned them, paid them, fed them, clothed them, armed them, housed them, even led them personally.
Wow.
And the best soldiers became officers. The smartest were trained for high government jobs, becoming viziers, top ministers.
So slavery as a route to the top.
Exactly. And Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, he massively expanded this. He made the Janissaries even more dependent, forbade them to marry, live outside barracks, or take up trades. They became maybe the most reliable standing army in Europe at the time. And, crucially, this weakened the old Turkish warrior class, whose lands were sometimes confiscated and whose positions in government were increasingly filled by these loyal slaves.
Were there any areas where these Kapikalu slaves didn't dominate?
A few, yeah. Pragmatic exceptions. The early Turks weren't seafaring people, so the Navy often relied on hired Balkan Christians, especially Greeks.
Makes sense.
And as diplomacy with European powers became more important, sometimes wealthy Greek merchants handled those negotiations. They had the languages, the contacts, but these were exceptions. The core military and administration became overwhelmingly Kapikalu.
Okay, so this powerful Kapikalu system needed a constant supply of recruits. Which brings us to the Devshirme. This was that levy of Christian boys from the Balkans, right?
Correct. When war captives weren't enough, they instituted the Devshirme, probably starting regularly in the 15th century. It happened periodically, maybe every 1 to 7 years.
How many boys?
Usually between 1,000 and 3,000 youths per levy, generally aged about 7 to 14. They look for physical potential, intelligence. Interestingly, artisans' sons were often excluded, probably to protect local craft industries.
Right. And what happened to them?
Well, first, they were considered slaves of the Sultan. They were converted to Islam, then put through really tough physical conditioning and mental discipline, often through hard labor initially. Then, the majority went into training for the Janissary Corps. A smaller group, the most intellectually promising, went to the palace schools for administrative training.
Now, here's where it gets really counterintuitive for us. We think of slavery, and we think of, brutal forced labor, chattel slavery. But you're saying this Devshirme system, parents sometimes wanted their children taken.
It's a crucial difference. Ottoman slavery, especially through the Devshirme, wasn't necessarily like the Atlantic slave trade model. For those with talent and dedication, getting into the Sultan's slave household, the Kapikalu, was a path to incredible power, wealth, status, public honor.
Merit-based, almost.
Largely, yes.
Yeah.
Promotion was often based on ability, not birth, which was pretty advanced compared to, say, aristocratic Europe at the time. A boy taken in the Devshirme could, theoretically, rise all the way to Grand Vizier, second only to the Sultan himself.
That's astonishing. So, ironically, this system of taking non-Muslim children actually offered them a kind of social mobility they wouldn't have had otherwise.
In many ways, yes. We have accounts, especially from poorer regions, of Christian parents actually begging officials to take their sons, sometimes even offering bribes. They saw the potential upside.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just Christians. Some Muslims apparently tried to get their kids included illegally, too.
Any specific examples?
The Bosnian Muslims are interesting. When they converted en masse, they apparently stipulated that their sons, taken in the Devshirme, would serve in the palace administration, not the regular military ranks. They understood the system's potential.
So by the late 1400s...
By then, yeah, the Kapikalu system, fed by the Devshirme, was totally dominant in the central military and administration. It became so powerful that the word Devshirme eventually stops meaning just the levy and started referring to this whole powerful, wealthy social class that came from it.
An incredible military administrative machine. But okay, an empire isn't just soldiers and bureaucrats. How did this state built on such, ruthless efficiency handle the daily lives, beliefs, and laws of this huge, diverse population? That brings us to the religious and legal heart of it all.
Exactly. You can't understand the Ottomans without understanding the role of Islam. It wasn't just the state religion. Islamic sacred law, the Sharia or Shariat, was the absolute core of the state. The Quran was the official law code. It was fundamentally an Islamic theocracy, part of that broader Islamic civilization.
And if the Quran didn't cover a specific situation, who interpreted or added to the law?
That was the job of the ulema. These were the learned religious scholars, the legal experts. They'd interpret the law based on the Quran, but also on the traditions and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. They mainly followed the Hanafid school of Islamic jurisprudence, which tended to be quite pragmatic.
So there's this balance then. The Sultan is autocratic, but he's still bound by Islamic law.
Precisely. His secular decrees, the canons, usually needed the stamp of approval from the head of the ulema to make sure they didn't contradict the Sharia. So the ulema acted as a kind of check on his power, a religious legal check.
And how was the ulema structured?
At the top was the Sheikh al-Islam, or Payul Islam, the chief mufti appointed by the Sultan. Below him were provincial muftis and the local judges, the qadis. And these qadis were really important figures locally. They handled both religious and secular legal matters. They supervised local administrators, and they even had ultimate authority over the janissaries, acting as police in their districts.
Interesting. So despite this strong Islamic framework, you mentioned pragmatism earlier. Did they incorporate existing laws from the places they conquered?
Oh, absolutely. They were very practical rulers, especially early on. They often incorporated existing secular laws from Byzantine, Serbian, Bulgarian, Bosnian territories right into their own canons. It just made sense. Eased the transition, avoided disrupting the economy too much, reduced the chance of rebellion. Local customs and laws often continued to function at the ground level.
Okay, this leads us to a really key topic, religious toleration. How did this Islamic State deal with its huge non-Muslim populations, especially Christians and Jews in the Balkans?
The peoples of the book.
Right.
Yeah.
Islam considers Jews and Christians peoples of the book
Yeah.
because they've written scriptures seen as coming from God, even if Muslims believe their current doctrines are flawed. The idea was that God would judge them, so they were allowed to practice their faiths within the Islamic State. This was different from pagans, who might be forced to convert or face harsher consequences. But this tolerance, it wasn't exactly equality, was it? There were conditions.
Definitely not equality. It was very conditional. These non-Muslims were known as zimmis, meaning protected ones. By accepting this status, they acknowledged the dominance of Islam and the Ottoman state. In return for protection, they had an inferior legal and social standing under Sharia.
How so?
Well, they paid discriminatory taxes that Muslims didn't. The big ones were the sizzi, that annual poll tax on adult males, and for Balkan Christians, the devshirme levy we talked about. There were also rules limiting the size or prominence of their churches or synagogues, restrictions on clothing, sometimes on riding horses or carrying weapons, and generally their testimony carried less weight against the Muslims in court.
So theological justification, but also maybe a practical economic reason for this toleration?
Absolutely pragmatic. From the start, Islamic expansion meant ruling over large non-Muslim populations. These zimmis were a huge source of revenue through those discriminatory taxes. It was simply good financial sense for the state to protect this tax base. In fact, for the first couple of centuries, non-Muslims in the Balkans probably equaled or even outnumbered Muslims in the entire empire.
Wow. So administratively, how do they manage these large non-Muslim communities, given that the Sharia primarily applied to Muslims?
That was a big challenge. Mehmed II, after conquering Constantinople in 1453, came up with a brilliant solution in 1454, the millet system. Millet basically means religious nation.
Ah, so grouping people by religion, not where they came from.
Exactly. It had nothing to do with ethnicity or territory. It was purely based on religious affiliation. He reasoned that each group's own religious laws could govern their internal affairs, just like Sharia governed Muslims.
So what were the main millets?
There were three main non-Muslim millets recognized. First, the Orthodox Christians, by far the largest group, including Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, Romanians, all under the Patriarch of Constantinople. Second, the Jews, led by their own chief rabbi. And third, the Armenian Christians, which also included other groups like Catholics. Muslims themselves formed a kind of de facto fourth millet.
And these millets had autonomy.
Considerable internal autonomy, yes. They could manage their own religious affairs, education, charities, even aspects of personal law like marriage and inheritance. The religious leaders gained significant civil authority over their communities, collecting taxes for the state, judging internal disputes, as long as it didn't clash with Ottoman law or security.
That's a really interesting distinction from the Western idea of a nation. No ethnic or territorial link, just religion.
Precisely. Your primary identity for centuries wasn't Serbian or Greek in a political sense. It was Orthodox Christian. People of different ethnicities but the same faith lived mixed together under the same millet administration. It was a very effective system for managing diversity.
And from the Ottoman perspective, probably quite a shrewd political tool, too.
Oh, incredibly shrewd. It allowed efficient administration according to Islamic principles, sure, but it also reinforced the divisions between the different non-Muslim groups. By organizing them separately under their own religious leaders, it made it much harder for them to unite and challenge Ottoman rule. The millet system was a key pillar holding the empire together in the Balkans for centuries.
Okay, we've covered the military and the legal structures. Let's get into the daily life, the socioeconomic side. The Ottomans had this term, raya, right? The flock.
Yes, that was the fundamental social division after a Muslim on Muslim. You had the askari, the ruling military administrative class we talked about, and then you had everyone else, the Riaya, literally the flock. This included both Muslims and Zimmis who weren't part of the ruling elite, their main job, to produce wealth, to support the rulers. The term itself implies they were to be, carefully managed so they could be taxed, but effectively fleeced beneficially, as one historian put it.
So what were the main economic goals of the Ottoman state for this flock? Was it about growth?
Not really in the modern sense. Their main goals were state survival, keeping internal order, and ensuring what they saw as just social relationships according to Islamic ideas. Stability and self-sufficiency were key. They were actually often kind of anti-growth, viewing big market expansions or rapid productivity increases with suspicion, too much financial uncertainty, risk of price spikes.
So they intervened in the economy.
Yes, but usually to guarantee essentials like food supplies or materials for the military, or to enforce fairness, clamping down on fraud, that sort of thing.
And revenue generation, how do they fund this whole enterprise?
Taxes, taxes, taxes.
Yeah.
Revenue was absolutely paramount. Basically, if it could be taxed, it probably was.
Yeah.
You had customs duties, taxes on trade, market fees, sales taxes, land use taxes called harass for some, taxes on pasturing animals, livestock taxes, road tolls, a household tax, Satan tax, court costs, fees for legal documents.
A long list.
And don't forget the really lucrative sizzi, the poll tax, specifically on non-Muslim males. That was a huge source of income. For general taxes, they often used the household, the korahain, as the basic unit. It spread the obligation and made collection more stable.
And the Balkan Riaya, the non-Muslims especially, were vital for this.
Absolutely critical. As we said, for a long time, they were the largest single group in the empire. Even later, they formed the majority in the Balkans and provided a huge chunk of the empire's tax revenue, especially through those extra zimmi taxes. The empire really relied on them.
What about life in the countryside? Most people were peasants, right? What was their situation like on those military fiefs, the Taimars?
Yes, the vast majority of Balkan Rei lived in villages on these fiefs. Their status is interesting. They had the right to use the land, usually through a lease from the Sipahi or the state. Importantly, they were not serfs like in much of contemporary Europe. They weren't tied to the land or owned by the lord in the same way.
So more freedom than European serfs.
Generally, yes. Their obligations were mainly to pay their taxes on time, often as a tithe, a share of the produce, sometimes in cash, and maybe work a few days a year on the Sipahi's personal plot, the sift.
That's another really surprising point. So for the average Christian peasant in the Balkans, Ottoman rule might have actually been better than what came before or what was happening next door.
The evidence strongly suggests that yes. Compared to the conditions under late feudalism in places like Hungary or Poland at the time, the Ottoman Zimmi peasant often had a far better lot. We actually see Christian peasants migrating into the Ottoman Balkans during the 15th and 16th centuries seeking better conditions. Their main burden as non-Muslims was that sizzi poll tax.
But you also mentioned some Zimmis had privileges, exemptions from taxes. That seems contradictory.
It does, but it shows that Ottoman pragmatism again. A significant portion, maybe nearly a third of Balkan Zimmis, had some kind of privileged status. This often meant exemption from the sizzi, sometimes other burdens too.
Why? What do they do?
They were usually grouped into categories based on services they provided to the state. Some provided military assistance, like the voinuks who supplied horses and transport, or the dervensis who guarded mountain passes. These groups might even be allowed weapons or certain clothing forbidden to other zimis.
Okay, military support, what else?
Others had crucial economic roles. Miners, medances, state-appointed livestock dealers, saleps, salt producers, falcon raisers for the court, rice growers in certain areas. Basically, if you provided a vital service or product, the state might grant you privileges in return. It was a trade-off. You could also gain privileged status by living on the sultan's private lands, or on tax-exempt religious endowments, the kiefs.
Makes sense. What about the towns and cities? How did they change under Ottoman rule?
Balkan towns became key centers, administrative headquarters, hubs for the millet system, centers for crafts, sometimes mining. Their look changed too. You saw an influx of Muslim officials, janissaries, artisans. Mosques and minarets started dominating the skyline. Many churches were converted into mosques. Non-Muslim houses were often required to be smaller or less conspicuous.
And how were cities organized? Did people live mixed together?
Usually in distinct neighborhoods called mahallis. These were often segregated by religion, sometimes by profession too. Each mahalli acted like a little corporate unit, responsible for things like tax collection within its boundaries, often run by elders, similar to village communes.
And the artisans, you mentioned guilds, esnafs.
Yes, artisans were crucial to urban life. and they were tightly organized into these guilds or esnafs. The state, through the local Qadi, kept a close eye on them, setting prices, regulating raw materials, setting quotas, controlling quality.
Setting prices, so not much free market there.
Not really for artisans, no. The system was heavily influenced by the Islamic concept of hizavel, basically, ensuring fair dealing, protecting people from price gouging, fraud, speculation. The Qadi would set what was considered a just price and a just profit margin. It was quite anti-profiteering.
Interesting. Were these guilds religiously exclusive?
Often not. Many guilds had both Muslim and non-Muslim members working side by side, and the sources suggest a degree of tolerance. Muslim guild members might even contribute funds for their Christian or Jewish brothers' religious festivals. The guild also acted as a social support network, helping members in need.
Okay, so artisans were tightly controlled. What about merchants? The ones doing bigger trade?
Merchants involved in long-distance or international trade were a bit different. They were a smaller group, but really important. Generally, they weren't subject to those strict Ariziba price controls.
Why not?
It fit better with Islamic ideas about trade and putting capital to work. They were allowed to accumulate wealth through legitimate trading activity. They had social privileges and were valuable to the state, providing customs revenue, sometimes making loans, acting as agents or suppliers.
And who are these merchants, typically?
International trade, especially, tended to be concentrated in the hands of groups who had the capital and networks for it, often Dalmatians from the coast, Greeks, or Jews.
So if we pull all this socioeconomic stuff together, what was the main goal? What was the overall impact on the people in the Balkans?
At the end of the day, the fundamental purpose of the whole Ottoman socioeconomic setup in the Balkans was pretty clear. Guarantee a steady, reliable stream of revenue for the rulers, for the state, for the askari.
Right.
As long as the Rhea, including the Zimis, paid their taxes and didn't cause trouble, they generally had a fair amount of autonomy in their own affairs, within their millets or villages or guilds. And because the state, especially the military structure, depended so heavily on those taxes, it was actually in the state's interest to protect the Rhea from excessive abuse by local officials or fief holders. Protecting the tax base was a core duty.
It really paints a picture of a complex interlocking system. We've looked at the military administrative engine, the religious legal framework with the millet system, and this socioeconomic structure designed for stability and revenue. It's all woven together.
Absolutely. It created this unique society operating on principles really quite different from what was happening in Western Europe at the time. Understanding these pieces, the Sipahilik, the Kapikulu, the Devshirmi, the millet, the role of the ulema, the economic controls it, really challenges those simplistic views of the Ottomans.
Yeah, it gives you a much richer appreciation for the nuances of state building, managing diversity, economic strategies, even social mobility in a completely different context.
It shows how sophisticated these systems could be, even if they seem alien or harsh to us now.
Definitely leaves us with a lot to chew on. And it raises a final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener. We talked about the Devshirim potentially being a path to power, and about Ottoman peasants possibly having a better deal than European serfs. So, could you argue? Could you make a case that for many ordinary people in the Balkans, the Ottoman conquest, despite the violence and upheaval, might have actually improved their daily lives in some ways, by replacing one set of rulers with another that paradoxically offered different kinds of stability and maybe even opportunity?
It's a challenging question, certainly worth pondering. What did security and opportunity look like from their perspective, not just ours?
Something to think about. That's all for this deep dive.